Okay, now we are ready. I'm giving right to Ganesh Rao straight away. Ganesh.
Yeah, I'm just waiting for the
Yeah.
camera. Okay,
Yes.
perfect. So while we were waiting for you to start, we just had a very quick introduction from the team side. Just wanted to know basically who's doing what and at which level are they currently. So probably helps us to understand as we go into the next session or the next level of enterprise pillar, we are able to better understand the mix of the audience here. So in case you have not tuned in yesterday and probably did not get an opportunity to know a little bit about me, I would just like to repeat for those of you who were there yesterday, please bear with me for a couple of minutes. I will try and tell you something that I did not tell you yesterday, so that will keep you interesting. At the same time, there are certain things that I will need to repeat again. So good morning to all of you. Welcome to this session. It is wonderful to see a very mixed group of audience to tune in to listen to the enterprise pillar E2. And for the purpose of introduction, my name is Ganesh Rao. I currently work with a multinational company. I have more than 21 years of corporate experience across various industry verticals, right from manufacturing, trading, construction, IT, ITES, and shipping. Across these industry verticals, I've managed to handle very diverse processes and activities, right from financial reporting, financial accounting, uh, management reporting, financial planning, variance analysis, and so on. I have worked in companies at various levels, had larger teams to smaller teams, performed individual contributor roles, did projects like implementation of SAP and so on from a functional perspective. So it is very interesting to reflect back on when I talk about myself to people that it has been a very nice journey covering various aspects of the corporate life. I've been primarily into finance and accounting and related activities, but under different domains. And the advantage of switching across different domains is the ability to connect them and to see what runs across as common between these industry domains. It is quite commonly said that finance and accounting is the same vanilla stuff everywhere you go, whether it is manufacturing, services, whether it is a banking operation, whether it is insurance. But having said that, there are specifics in each industry, and while it is the fundamental rules and concepts that apply everywhere, depending on the industry you work for, you will have to adapt yourself to what is the requirement of the industry. And over the last 20 years, I was mentioning yesterday that the country that we live in and the environment around the world has significantly changed from a paper-based, traditional, tall, hierarchical structures and the way we work. The work that we had seen and understood in the past has been redefined. So we'll talk about that a little bit when we get into the strategy, approaches to strategy and so on, and of course, organizations, teams, culture, and so on. Going back to a little bit more about me, I've also had a very deep interest in teaching. I've done a lot of small teaching assignments. It is always interesting to see how you can impact people by sharing what you know. It may sound very silly, but then the interest and the passion that we have when we see others understanding and applying it probably is priceless. And that is why probably I'm here to share some of my experiences over the last 20 years that I've gone through, while also touching on the academic aspects of the current subject. I've had a quick look at all of your background. I think some of you are working, some of you are students, some of you are into strategic level, and some of you are into management level. For the sake of repetition, there are certain areas that I will repeat from yesterday, probably go into a little bit of a detail. For the rest, we'll try and cover the essence of what we're trying to communicate. This is only an overview session, primarily aimed at introduction to certain concepts. E2 is a very vast subject. It has various concepts, examples, references to industry, and areas where it can be applied. And it has been applied as well by many companies. So we'll try and touch upon them a little bit as we move on, but we will have to keep it to a level of high level of detail, to a higher level than to be detailed. So what I would do is I will move on to the first slide. As we move on to the first slide, I will also give you a perspective of how E2 is different than E1 and what are we trying to do in the enterprise pillar. As a matter of ensuring that all of you are with me throughout this journey of 90 plus minutes, it's important that you continue to give me feedback on the chat box. I would stop at the end of each slide for you to reflect on what we've covered, for you to ask questions, for you to put across your views or comments, and then we move on to the next topic or subject slide. So in terms of strategy, so I was mentioning yesterday that strategy is all about a plan of action of how to achieve something, and stems primarily from the concept of having a vision and a mission in place and then going about dealing with it or handling that. Just wait for the slides to come up. So here we're talking more about the subject is more about project relationship management, talks about the fundamentals of strategy, the concepts of strategy, the models of strategy, and how organizations over a period of time have used these various approaches depending on how they've wanted their end state to be. So if I look at organizations that we see in the last 20 years, if I take the Amazon and the Googles and the Facebook of the world, their strategies have evolved over a period of time. Google started off with purely being a search engine. Today they are looking at driverless cars. Amazon started off selling books. Today they're looking at primetime shows. They're looking at so many other diversification. So an organization normally starts with something what they call as the intended strategy, or they believe they need to get into. Due to the changes around them, due to the constant movement of the ground below them, they end up evolving over a period of time to suit those changes. We've seen that enough around us, and I don't need to give you enough examples on that. But fundamentally, I think it's all about how your company wants to pursue those strategies. How long term are they in nature? How are you logically doing it? Are you making use of the opportunities around you, or are you exploiting the market and the consumer needs? Are you basically looking at the cost structures? Are you looking at the economic situations of either the country where the goods are produced, or the country or the region or the geography where the goods are and the services are consumed? So various dynamics come into play. In terms of strategy, there are different levels of strategy. We have the corporate strategy, we have the business strategy, and the functional strategy. Corporate strategy are fundamentally addressing questions of, what is our purpose, what is our mission, what is our intent, which markets should we be part of, what is that we are really here for. It's more at the organization level. It talks about areas such as the investments, divestments, mergers, acquisition. It talks about relationship with stakeholders. It talks about decision to enter new markets, or decision to have a strategic alliance or a joint venture or some kind of a partnership. So completely at the enterprise level, decisions mostly on market, customers, profitability, long-term vision, and so on. But business strategy covers areas such as which products or services that I want to expand, where do I diversify, which service lines or product lines give me adequate revenue, how many people to employ, how do I design my organization for a product or a service, and so on. Function strategy is more operational in nature, primarily in terms of day-to-day work, day-to-day production, day-to-day delivery of services, in terms of how we meet our targets, how we plan our resources, how we organize our resources, and so on and so forth. So these are the types of strategy. So strategies, of course, also are planned. As I said, there is an intention to do something. So there is a plan, there is a logical process of arriving at a plan strategy, where you look at what you want, where you want to be as a vision, then what is the purpose as a mission, and then you look at your goals and objectives, and then you say, this is how I would like to achieve. Usually it is done with a lot of planning, it is done with a lot of time and effort of employees or people at the top level in the management. And it also includes certain factors that they consider as dependencies or triggers. As we know, planning can be as good as how the environment around us remains stable, but that's not the case today. So planned strategies do suffer from changes around us as well. Emergent strategies are strategies as they emerge when you come across various scenarios into the business. Fundamentally, it emerges from opportunities that lay outside, whether it is resources, whether it is economic policies, whether it is government policies, whether changes in the global trade, restrictions, sanctions. There are so many things. While there are sanctions between certain countries, as you see from example from US to China, or US to Iran, or US to North Korea, as good examples today, there is a clear benefit that other countries in the region get from these sanctions, because the viability or the feasibility to import or export due to the sanctions increases for other countries around the region. So that's again one way of looking at it. So something doesn't work well between two countries, there's always an opportunity for an alternate location for either a collaboration or a trade or partnership or investment. Incrementalism talks about how you logically extend. So while you have a strategy, you have an intended strategy, you decide to do something not on a large scale, not on a long term. You start with something, and then based on small logical extensions of the current strategy, you exploit the opportunities. And again, opportunistic or opportunism, or they call the freewheeling opportunism, is purely, absolutely not connected to where you started, where you are. I think Google is a good example. If you ask me, where they started and where they are, they still have what they have, the core business, but they moved on to Android and applications and cloud and driverless car and so many other areas, which was not where they wanted to really be 20 years back. So this is how strategies evolve. The strategic planning process involves analysis, various options available, and then there is an implement. So it's a process basically. You conceptualize, you identify a plan, you have basically an option evaluation of all the plans. Then you go about implementing them. You need to know whether what you've implemented is really working. Then you go into evaluation or assessment of it, and then you see what needs to be controlled, what needs to be changed, what is the feedback that you hear from the implementation process that needs to undergo changes, whether it is minor or major. And then there are approaches on strategy based on resource or position. For example, resource-based approach talks about competencies. So you have resources in an organization that carry certain competencies or capabilities. How do you better exploit them in order to see whether you are able to get the full benefit of it? So it is more inward looking, it is not outward looking. So I have certain capabilities, how can I use those capabilities in order for us to make use of the opportunities around us, versus the position. So currently you are manufacturing a product or you're delivering a service which is considered very unique, which is considered your core competency, which means you are very good at that. How can you further enhance it? How can you use that opportunity or competency to further enhance your position? And then of course, these are all ones that apply for profit organizations. So organizations which are primarily talking about profits. So for non-profit, we don't talk about the strategies in terms of goals or objectives for money or wealth creation or stakeholder uh, enhancement and so on. We talk more in terms of efficiency, economy, and effectiveness. So effectiveness is basically about your outcome or goal. So how effective has your strategies been? Efficiency is all about whether the inputs that you're putting in is giving you the desired results. And economy is all about how can you do what you're doing with optimal resources, least cost, and so on. And last but not the least, there are fundamental questions that come from Peter Drucker, one of the management gurus. He says a question that every company should ask themselves every single time when they go in for a strategy implementation or strategy evaluation is, who's my customer? What is my mission? What is my plan? What are our results? How do I measure my results? What does the customer really value? I mean, we talked about value addition yesterday briefly. While there are different companies doing the same product, but a customer perceives certain things as value. So how can I basically understand what the customer values in each and every product or service I deliver? So I'll stop it here for a minute or maybe half a minute for you to reflect on, and if there are any questions, if you can quickly type in, and then we can go on to the next topic. Any questions, any thoughts, any further elaboration or explanation required? Hello? So I'm moving on. So I'm assuming that everybody is clear and you don't need any further elaboration on this. So moving on to the next concept here. Again, this is held or dealt very fundamentally in the enterprise pillar in E1. In E2, we are slightly going into a little bit of detail on mission statements, types of goals, effective goal statements or goal setting exercises or methods, talking about critical success factors, we're talking about key performance indicators and so on. So in an organization, it is important for us, I would have to repeat this again because we need to bring the context in terms of what and why we have mission, vision and objectives. So a mission typically talks about the purpose of an organization. What is the reason why an organization exists today? Why is that you're doing what you're doing today? And it stems from the vision. The vision is nothing but your end state, your future state, a situation that you want to see yourself, a position that you want to command the market, a brand or a perception that you want to create amongst the customers, amongst the stakeholders, society, the regulatory bodies, the government, and so on. So the vision basically talks about where you want to go. The mission talks about why you want to go there. And the strategy talks about how you would go there. And in order for us to cover the end state with a why and how, it's important for us to understand what are we actually targeting as milestones or targets for us to define and clearly understand whether we are going where we are going. We are going in the direction of where we're supposed to go. We are going at the same speed, at the same cost, at the same quality, at the same time, at the same satisfaction of our key stakeholders, and so on to the final goal or the final state that we want to be in. So intertwined between the vision, mission, and the strategy are the goals and the objectives. And we talked about yesterday again, or we've seen concepts about SMART objectives. We talk about being specific, being measurable, being achievable, being realistic, and being time bound. So it's important to be extremely specific to what you think your objective is, because objectives can be very vague. If it's not specific, it can be very hazy, very volatile, very open-ended, and sometimes you don't know whether you actually met it because you cannot measure it. At the same time, it has to be measurable. So it has to be tangible, it has to be verifiable, it has to be measurable. So we have this concept of TVM. We say anything that we talk about, it's typically a jargon used in project management, where they say anything that you do, anything that you set out to gain has to be has to be tangible, verifiable, and measurable. So you need to be tangibly felt. It has to be validated, verified by anybody who has an understanding or understands what the goals are set, and it has to be also measurable. We need to know how far we've achieved it. Similarly, then we talk about achievable or attainable. So you can't put impossible targets, you can't put inappropriate, irrelevant targets or plans. It has to closely tie in with the objectives that we set out for. Similarly, it has to be realistic. It has to be within an influence or control, a reasonable control or influence of the team, of the function, of the leader, of the individual who is handed out this target or objective. And of course, the most important thing in today's world is being very time bound, time specific, or deadline based, timeline based, which means everything has an expiry period, everything has an end time. Everything is measured good or bad, not only because of quality, but also whether it is done within a certain period of time, within a certain specific time period. Because you can deliver certain things at good quality, but if you do it 1 year later, I'm not sure if a customer would still want it. The relevance of a need or a want of a customer quickly expires or becomes irrelevant if certain products are delivered beyond a time. I mean, there are a lot of examples when it comes to online marketing. Online shopping, if you look at delivery of perishable items, if you look at when it comes to events and birthdays and anniversaries, the concept of gifting beyond the time. If you can't give somebody a week later after the anniversary, it is absolutely irrelevant. So in organizations, when teams are formed with objectives to achieve something, it is extremely important that there is an element of time that is put into, so that the whole objective becomes more meaningful. Moving on into the critical success factors. Now, while you set a target as a goal or objective, I'm using the word target because it is easy to understand, but targets are subsets of objectives. So an objective has a target, and target is nothing but a focus area to achieve. Now, for us to achieve an objective, we need to really understand the opposite. We need to understand what can make the objective not be achievable. We should look at what can happen, what risks we need to identify, what dependencies we need to factor in, what areas that are beyond our control that possibly can change as we start our journey. So the critical success factors today are areas that are important for organizations to focus on to ensure the goals are and the objectives are achieved. So it's more of looking at what are the key success factors, what needs to happen in order for us to believe that the goals will be achieved or the objectives will be achieved. And these success factors or critical success factors are clearly documented, thought through adequately, and also then converted into what is called the key performance indicators. KPI are very common in today's world. Every organization has KPIs. Some organizations have KPIs more than the number of employees they have. Some organizations keep it very short, very focused. The fallout of having a large number of performance indicators means that an organization cannot focus on all of them at the same time. Because the moment you set a KPI or a key performance indicator, you also put in metrics to measure the progress and the outcome. And if you have too many of them, I think a lot of time would be wasted on setting up the KPI, recording information or data, measuring and reporting, than actually targeting actions towards improvement. Because what happens typically in KPI driven action is, if there are too much time spent on deciding on what actions to be taken, less time is spent on taking actions. And by the time you are ready to take an action, a month or a couple of months goes by. So either your environment is changing, either your customers are expecting resolutions quickly. So if you want to change something from a customer satisfaction perspective, if you take an example, you've got a survey, you've got adverse results on certain products, and you're trying to measure how bad it is, you're trying to measure why was it bad, you're trying to do a root cause analysis to find out what actions need to be taken in order for the product to be improved. If you take a couple of months or a quarter, I think every day when you sell the product for several weeks, months from the day you got the feedback, I think you're almost at the beginning of the end of your product line, because by the time the competition kicks in, the customer looks at alternate options, he tries alternate products, and sometimes he would never come back and use yours at all. So performance indicators are great. Key performance indicators are important for us to really identify what is key for the organization, and it is always a drill down approach. So the KPIs stem from the levels of strategy, from corporate to a business to a functional. So it doesn't mean the entire organization only has a set of KPIs. At different departments and at different unit level, KPIs are set in such a way that a particular department or a small team or a group of individuals focus on what is relevant to them, and it is rolled out onto the top for the entire organization to look at. So I'll cover a little bit of stakeholder analysis down the line. So we'll quickly move on to the next topic. Before that, I want to be sure that so far I've got a question on position. Wonderful. So Chanda has a question. Can you please once again explain position? So typically what happens in today's strategic approach is that the approaches to strategy has both resource view and position view. As I talked about, resource view is more about just a moment. So the resource view talks about competencies or capabilities. The position view talks about your current position in the market. So you approach any strategy formulation on the basis of your current position. Whether you are a market leader or you are a challenger or you are a laggard, I mean, are you trailing behind? Do you have products and services that are very unique to a particular geography or a market or a culture? So it is purely the position the organization is currently in and the product or the service that the organization believes needs revamp or enhancement. So because the position is something that is depending on the market, your position would be different depending on how the market changes or the consumer taste changes. So it's important to understand that the position, while you have competencies, the flip side of depending too much on competency based or capability based is you continue to harness your capabilities, you continue to enhance the potential of the resources you have, whether it is human, whether it is technical, whether it is knowledge, and so on, but you forget the market view. So position view talks about the market view. It talks about new developments, new technologies, change in taste, economic regulations, economic scenarios changing, policies coming in from the government that help or do not help a particular industry, and so on. So that is what we mean by position-led view of strategic approach. Is it clear? Any other questions? Chanda, is it clear for you? Okay, thanks a lot. So let's move on to the next slide. I'm assuming that all of you are with me so far in terms of what we are covering. If you're working, you must have already been exposed to certain topics that we are covering today. All we have to do is try and link it to understand the theoretical and the conceptual understanding of what it is versus what we see at workplace. So I'll try and give you some examples when we do more of these in detail in terms of how KPIs, for example, if I take an example of KPI, what kind of KPIs are good, what kind of KPIs are bad, and why the companies get entangled with this I would say fashion of having KPIs, and how KPIs sometimes drive behavior. So if you set a KPI saying attendance or punctuality is also a KPI, you have to be in the office for you to have a point or a grade or a credit scored in your KRA, in your annual appraisal. So you got to be in the office 10 minutes before every single day for the whole of the year. You can definitely see that it will drive behavior. Now, organizations do not consider hygiene factors like attendance, punctuality, being on time, and all that anymore today. They are looking at productivity based approach, they're looking at quality based approach, they're looking at efficiency, so utilization, they're looking at how much time do you have and how much more are you able to produce or work. They don't look at whether you came on time, whether you came late, how many hours you worked. Those are very traditional ones that today does not really matter for a lot of companies. But then if you take a simple example of coming on time or being on time to the office, it behaves significantly well in such a fashion that people start blindly imbibing on it. So that's why they say KPIs drive behavior. If you want to improve a behavior, you have to put a KPI for it, and that is where it becomes very difficult, because if you ask a group of 10 people what KPIs should be put in place, you will at least get 10 from each person, and you can't manage and monitor all of them. So moving on to the external internal analysis. So what is also important, as we talked about from a position-based view, is the understanding of the environment around us, the external and the internal. So of course we have different stakeholders. Stakeholders can be classified as internal, external. Stakeholders also are completely outside the organization, like government, society, regulatory bodies, environmental agencies, human rights agencies. There are so many of them today who are basically involved or very closely connected with what is happening in the organizations, because there is a large amount of visibility about these things today. There is enough information available in public domain. There is enough ways and means to identify what is happening with the company. So in terms of five forces model, Michael Porter talks about the environment of basically competition. So he basically brings in an element of competition to the five forces. He talks about how these forces continue to play in a manner that defines competition. Now, competition is always inherent in every business activity, like risk is inherent. The competition sometimes may take a little bit of time to fully kick in because you are a pioneer or it is a very nascent market, or probably the customers are not sure about whether you really are producing something they want. So that is where marketing comes in. The marketers basically create the awareness and need in the customers, where they say that you've been doing this so far, now it is time to look at something else. The switch from where they are today to what they should aspire for is what marketing is all about. And I think we have examples again that we've seen in the world, from a typical two-wheeler household setup to a small car to a compact car. It is basically a shift of mindset, and of course supported by globalization, where companies came in, did mass production, got a price to a level where the difference between these two different types of modes of transport was not significantly different. And then of course, with economy booming, with finance companies, banks coming out with loans and offers, the entire scenario changed between mid 90s to, I would say, mid 2000. Now the need to have something again emanates or arises from the way the people who produce these products and services look at the future. So Porter talks about competition, he talks about rivalry, he talks about five different things. So he talks about the competition, which is a center theme that brings in rivalry between different competitors, are basically caused by four different factors. So the four different forces that brings in competition or rivalry are: one, threat of new entrants. So you have a new entrant coming into an industry. There are a lot of industries where entering is not easy. Good example is shipping. A ship probably takes 5 to 7 years to be ready. It requires a few $1,000,000. It requires a minimum of 5 to 6 years. And if you see today's world, the demand you have today and the demand that you forecast 7 years down the line may be completely different. Sometimes organizations order something only to realize a couple of years down the line that what they already have today is excess. So capacity is a problem. You already are carrying goods for the customers only at 70% utilization. You're not utilizing your ships or containers fully. But there is a fixed cost. You have to employ people, you have to bring in fuel, you have to perform all the ancillary activities for a shipment to be completed. So sometimes it becomes very difficult. So if I'm a shipping company, I can bet that it is almost impossible for a person to start a new shipping company or to start buying ships to start a shipping company. This applies to a lot of other companies, where the capital is pretty intensive. The the labor workforce is difficult to ramp. The geographical location where the unit or the manufacturing setup has to be done takes time. So usually it is a barrier. Entry is a barrier. Similarly is the power of suppliers. So if you are a company doing manufacturing, and if you are probably not a big company, but you are basically sourcing raw materials from a company either equal to your size or bigger than you, there's always a possibility that you have to bargain, because for that company you may be one of the several customers. We always tend to believe that we have a much larger bargaining power with suppliers than with customers, but it doesn't happen in certain industries. In certain industries, the suppliers are pretty strong. Their base are very big, their customer spread is very high or very wide. So even though you're a customer to them, you don't actually have the power to bargain. Dell is a good example, actually, because Dell, what they do is, in fact, they were the first to bring this concept of custom designed PCs. So in the late 80s, when Michael Dell was trying to compete with the big likes of HP and IBM, of course we had a few Asian giants, but if you look at the US market, where technology was at the forefront during the 70s and the 80s, you would see that he would bring in a concept of people actually configuring their own PCs. So he made the platform available for people to actually decide what processors should go with what RAM, with what kind of ancillary units, whether it's a monitor or it's keyboard. So he almost made it so easy for a customer to decide what he wants. Because what also happens is sometimes a customer is forced to buy something because a manufacturer has produced it in a large scale quantity. So this is what we call the push strategy. You continue to manufacture, you continue to churn out day in, day out in anticipation of what you think the customer wants, versus the pull strategy, where you actually look at trying to constantly understand what the customer wants and have a very lean production process or manufacturing process where you can quickly change your configuration and also give the power to the customer to decide in some cases. In certain industries, it may not work so easily, but in certain industries, it does. If you see some of the manufacturers of automobiles, I think it's a good example. The first few takes several months for delivery because there is a craze, there is a launch, there is a aspirational value to buy something that is just coming in the market. So people queue up, they know the brand or the company before, they believe in the foundation and the quality and the service that they provided in the past, and they go for it. But after that, if you see, the models are available at an easier delivery date, because they have kept their manufacturing pace in line with what the customer wants. And they also know that if they continue to have a 3-month waiting period for cars for next several years, probably the competitors will woo those customers away. So going back to this concept of power of suppliers, it's also applicable to power of customers. You have a large customer who has several small suppliers. At any point in time, of course contractually, but at any point in time, you can withdraw any contract or any tie-up with any supplier and say, I don't want this product from next month. Either he's got a better quality product from another supplier, or he's got something at a better cost, or there are other improvements that a supplier is doing which this supplier is not doing. It is not about quality or cost, but it's probably about value addition or improvements that the customers want because of the changing need of the end customer or the end user. If I take an example of Ford as a manufacturing car company, their ancillary industry, which primarily revolves around their supply chain from an inward perspective, has to constantly change the models or the variants depending on what the end customer wants. So they can't have a supplier who cannot adapt to those changes. And supplier cannot have a push strategy saying, I've already manufactured 3 months of raw materials for you or 6 months of raw materials for you because that's what you wanted. It's a wasted inventory for me, so please buy from me, and please tell your end customer that for the next 6 months I will not be able to make any changes to any specific customer requirements in my car, for example. So Michael Porter also talks about new entrants. Sorry, it talks about substitutes. So in any product line, you always have substitutes. I mean, the best example that I've studied or read, and I've always associated substitutes is with tea and coffee. Today, we have companies that manufacture coffee, that brew tea. People always think that from brand A to brand B, people move from, let's say, for example, Nestle to maybe Abbott or any other brands, food processing brands, when it comes to coffee or similar food products. But they don't realize that somebody can decide to switch from a coffee to a tea, or maybe from a coffee tea to something similar that probably is more healthy, more tasty, more cheaper, whatever it is. So sometimes companies end up competing within themselves. You see Brook Bond doing coffee, Brook Bond doing tea as well. You see some companies, they keep competing in such a way that sometimes customers keep changing between the different tastes. So there's always a threat that that if you oversell certain product line, you end up killing your own alternate or substitute line. And that is where companies are very careful as well. They do segment them. They do make it premium sometimes, which they think, if they think the tea is bringing them the good margin, they continue to make it better. So if you look at any of these tea brands, like for example, again, Brook Bond. So they have this Brook Bond Gold. I mean, it was just the new version or the improved version of what they already had. Possibly there are some changes. I'm not saying that, I'm not an expert to tell you that there's no change between what they had and what they have today. But it is only a very incremental change to what they must have already been selling in the market. Similarly, all these play a role. So a new entrant and substitute, a supplier bargaining power or a customer bargaining power intensifies the rivalry, and competition sits around these factors or forces. And if you are able to be competitive, which means you are able to beat the competition, you have to overcome, you have to understand these forces and work on them. Moving on to the next topic in terms of the Porter's diamond model. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this particular slide because it is very relevant. It is completely on what we see around us. So let's quickly go on to the diamond model. So diamond model, Porter talks about the certain factors that are important for a firm to survive in a competitive landscape. So he says the key drivers are factor inputs, factors of production, as we must have studied in economics, raw material, land, labor, and so on. Then it talks about related industries. So if you're entering into an industry, what is important is to understand whether there are other industries related to this industry from which either you can benefit or have heavy competition. Then it's all about demand. Now, a lot of the companies start manufacturing products and services based on a perceived demand. There is a market research done. There are a lot of studies done on what potentially customers are consuming today or using today. But then it is only a first point or a starting point. You have to anticipate a demand. You have to look at what the market potential is. First, you have to look at if there is 1 million population in an area. If I confine myself to a geography or a region or an area, and if I look at only a very small business, I should look at potentially how many people are actually living in that area. So if I take an example of a two-wheeler manufacturer of scooters, and if I target women primarily from a teenager to maybe a late 40 or early 50s, the first and the foremost thing that I would look at is the potential of the market. How many people do we believe potentially would be using it? Is the public transport better? Is it safer? Is the frequency is good? Is it convenient? Do people perceive going in public transport as below their status? And so on and so forth. I mean, there are so many other factors to look at. So typically what happens in a market potential is the intent is to look at the market and say, okay, out of, let's say, 1 lakh people, I'm assuming half a lakh women, maybe 2 lakh people in that age category between, let's say, 15, 16 years to 45, 50 years. And among them, how many actually are housewives, working, studying, and so on and so forth. So it's so many different factors they have to look at. And then we have to look at sales potential, where of those people, 2 lakh, typically falling in that age bracket, how many of them would be able to buy in this price range? How many of them would be able to use this effectively for whatever they are doing, whether they're studying, teaching, working, having their own business, and so on. So demand becomes important, and estimation of demand is always shooting in the dark. I mean, you have certain idea of where you are going, but it needs to be very dynamic in order for you to keep changing as it moves forward. And of course, the firm and the structure. So amongst the factor inputs, the demand and the ancillary related industries, what is important is the structure of the firm and the strategy, which is internal to the firm, right? You can decide how to structure yourself, how to strategize yourself, how to define the plan of action, and so on. SWOT analysis. Basically, it talks about strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Something that we all have heard about. Typically, what happens in a SWOT analysis is the outcome of SWOT analysis helps organizations to understand where they stand and what they need to do. See, analysis is as good as an action that can be taken to reach your desired state. So if I talk about a strength, I have a strength in a certain product or service. I have a strength in my customer centricity, or the way I serve my customers, the way I care for my customers. So what do you do with that? How can you use the strength to beat the competition? How can you enhance it further? How can you make sure that this becomes your core competency? We'll talk about competencies a little bit later, but it's a core competency. Similarly with weaknesses. So you have a weakness, you identified something to be a weakness. The weakness is either in relation to where you are in a company, as a company. It can be in relation to the competition or the environment outside. You believe it's a weakness for you. So what are you doing to overcome? What have you thought about? Is this something that you want to live with? Is it something that you want to do something about? Opportunities. You see there is an opportunity. You see there is a possibility. You see there is a then options and choices available for you to do something. How do you go about doing it? Do you have a timing for it? Do you need to do something specific that you're not doing today? Do you need to put some group of people into looking at those opportunities further, maybe elaborate, maybe go into more detail? And interestingly, the opportunities again are closely linked to the strength. So if you see certain opportunities that you see in the market today, the question is one of the strength that you have. How do you use the opportunities to be exploited? How can you use your strength to basically tap the opportunities? Does your strength good enough to explore those opportunities? And so on and so forth. And if not, can you develop? Can you enhance the strength so that it continuously keeps looking at your opportunities that you see around you, and then exploit it. Similarly with threats. So weaknesses are more internal, strengths are more internal, opportunities are more outward looking, threats are more outward looking. Threats talks about all the areas that typically that you can face, the issues that you can face, the problems you can face. Threat is a very simple term which basically means the risk of something happening. Now, if you have a weakness, do you want to expose the weakness so that the threats are further magnified? Or do you want to use the strengths to make sure that you counter those threats? Most importantly, do you understand those threats? Do you understand whether those threats are indeed something that you can do something about, and how your competencies or your unique position in the market can counter that? So SWOT analysis is very common. It is done in teams, it is done at department level, it is done in large organizations. Every few years, every couple of years, usually, or 3 years, when there is changes in significant changes in the market or the environment, companies go through an exercise of doing a SWOT analysis. It's a very subjective analysis. There is no data or validation that can be provided. You can substantiate with explanations of why you see something as a threat or an opportunity or a strength or a weakness. Having said that, it is very subjective. It is left to the not the imagination, but it is left to the discretion of people, assuming that they have a certain amount of skill and knowledge to be able to assess that subjectivity. Moving on to generic strategies. So Porter talks about strategies such as focus strategy, differentiation strategy. We'll probably cover it in detail as we go, but it talks about whether strategies are indeed focused on a particular market. Is it niche? Is it mass? Is it something that is intended to woo a particular segment of customers? Is it intended to exploit a particular area where there is a gap between what people have or people need versus what is available? Similarly, differentiation. So as a product or a service, while people have what they need, are you able to create a differentiation where customers can go for your products or services? Moving on to Ansoff matrix. So Ansoff matrix talks about the market development strategies, basically about where you are in the current market versus the future market. Here it talks about the possibilities and opportunities. It talks about the current position of you and your product in the market and how do you see it. So if you want to develop a market in the current product, so you have a product in a particular market, so you have product A in market X and you want to develop it. So you basically do what? What would you do? What would you do if you want to develop a particular product in the same market that is already existing? Can I have some answers from any of you?